Canada is drowning in debt. Households, provinces, and even the federal government are all leveraged to the hilt. And the only way out of this is through very high inflation. This is a debt trap long disguised as prudent and effective policy, but the cracks are starting to show. In this episode, we'll look at the data that proves why Canada is stuck and how this trap is quietly affecting your savings, your housing, and even the Canadian dollar as we know it. Here's the proof. Government debt servicing costs, not paying down the debt, just staying afloat, is now soon to outpace healthcare in Canada. And in the long term, this is anything but sustainable. The reality is, Canada is in the late stages of what is known as a long-term debt cycle. And in this video, we'll go through the difference between a short-term and a long-term debt cycle, the levers of actions that policymakers, such as central banks and government officials, use to maneuver these debt cycles, identifying where Canada is in its long-term debt cycle, even its short-term debt cycle, as well as any current trends and data to support these ideas. And finally, I will leave you guys with some actionable steps you can take to not only preserve, but increase your purchasing power and to gain the ability to opt out of a system that has failed you and me time and time again. Let's quickly go over the difference between a short-term and a long-term debt cycle. On the short term, we have a snippet of some data from the Canadian 10-year, and it's about 5 to 7 year snippet of price history. Okay, so within that window, 5 to 7 to even 10 years is classified as a short-term debt cycle. And so what does a debt cycle even mean? Well, you can think of it a boom and then a bust, which leads to the downside. And this in turn creates a cyclicality in the nature of debt. So where are we in the short term? Well, during COVID was the bust. A black swan event shocked the nation. Rates fell, a lot of debt got issued, and then we went into an inflationary boom. Then rates got hiked, we almost had a bust, and now we're in the current phase of cycling back into a boom. That is a short term. However, in the long term, we need to take a more macro scope to our viewpoint. And here I have about 60 plus years on the right of 10-year data. And on the long term, we need to think of not just boom and bust cycles, but a currency life cycle. And so in that, we have peak living, right, where incomes are high relative to debt, a booming middle class, low wealth inequality, things of this nature. And so at the peak of the middle class, money stretches far, money has high content of energy, and later on through the cycle, the money loses its energy, its purchasing power. And then we encroach on the bust phase of the long-term debt cycle, which, if you haven't noticed, is where a lot of the countries in the West are currently sitting. To combat this, to extend the currency's life, to squeeze every ounce of energy they can out of a currency, policymakers, especially in this later phase of the long-term debt cycle, resort to three levers. And that would be restructuring, which is just a fancy word for default, austerity, where they stop spending, or inflation, a repressive regime. And now, 11 times out of 10, policymakers always choose the easy way out, which is repress and inflate the value away. Because austerity is deflationary and is incongruent with the debt-based monetary system, which is inflationary by nature. And a country that defaults on its debt will have civil unrest, capital flight, and overall diminishing trust in that nation's ability to, quote unquote, serve its people. When we look at Canada specifically, and when we look for symptoms of the late innings of a long-term debt cycle, of a fiat currency's final stage in life, Canada exhibits a multitude of these factors. To name a few, our government is well over $1 trillion in debt. Our households are levered 2 to 1, so debt to income ratios are 180%. We have fiscal dominance, where financing the government becomes the central bank's number one priority, or the central bank becomes a tool for the government to continue financing themselves at the expense of its citizens. And in order to do so, they keep rates below inflation, which is in turn a repressive regime. The first piece of data we have is a simple ratio. It's the Canadian debt to GDP. So if you think of a country as a business, GDP is what we make as a country, and the debt is what we spend. Okay? And due to the nature of our monetary system, being in a debt-based monetary system, all governments can run deficits. They can deficit spend. They can spend more than they make because of the way our monetary system, our money is designed. So what does this chart tell us? Well, what stands out to me is the point in time when debt began to skyrocket just before 2010. What happened before then? 2008, the great financial crisis. The whole world blew up, and that was the first time the government and the central banks decided to bail out private sector banks at the expense of you and me. Through quantitative easing and liquidity backstops, aka printing the money, they were able to stop the banks from going bust. But in turn, they stuck it on the central bank's balance sheet. And so in turn, debt began to skyrocket. The next one is just federal debt, flat out. No ratio, just flat out. Governments spending more than they make. Take a look. Holy shit. Balance sheets of the national banks in Canada depicts this situation quite well. Instead of doing the right thing, the hard thing, instead of establishing some form of proof of work, the government and the Bank of Canada decided to finance themselves at the expense of you and me by sticking all their liabilities and all of their deficits onto the bank's balance sheets. look at it. Yes, there's this periods of time where it coils, stays pretty flatlined. However, those periods are met with an explosion to the upside. The only way out is to debase the currency. If you debase the currency, the debt that is held in that unit of account will in turn lose its value, because the governments have no way of paying this back except by taxing us through inflation and perpetually debasing the dollar. And now, if you don't want to be trapped in that same roller coaster, then you need to take action. You need to opt out of the system by exchanging your worthless pieces of paper for a hard, real asset. You need to establish your own proof of work. Gold and Bitcoin. You can argue about that, which one is better, in another video. But the point is, the Canadian dollar will become worth less over time, because that is how the government sustains its deficit spending. If you guys enjoyed this video, drop a comment down below. Let me know if you learned anything. Let me know if you have any questions. Hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe. The feedback has been pretty awesome recently, and I really appreciate it all. But you guys know, I'm trying to build a channel, trying to help educate you and myself on finance and the ever-evolving macro landscape. As always, it's been Chris. I'll catch you guys in the next video.